All right. So thank you all for having me here today. This is amazing. This is super awesome to be able to come down to Brazil and talk about web components with all of you. As we mentioned, I'm Rob Dodson. If you want to follow me on G+ or Twitter, that is the place to do it. All of my slides, I will be tweeting them out and putting them on G+ after the talk today. So if you want to get the slide deck, please follow. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about web components, and I want to do it in 3 parts. The first part is I want to just give like a really high-level overview of what web components are. You know, what problems do web components solve? What are we as developers? What are the challenges that we're facing all the time? And how can web components make our jobs a bit easier? And then I want to show off some of the really cool stuff that developers are already building with web components. And maybe some of you guys are in this room, actually. That would be pretty cool. And lastly, I want to talk about how everyone here can join in on this revolution and really help grow this ecosystem. So if you're new to web components, you've never heard of them before, if you never worked with them before, we'll talk about how you can get up and running. And if you're already working with web components, I can show you some tools to make you a little bit faster and a little bit more efficient. But I want to start with just like a high-level overview so that we're all kind of on the same page. And typically, I like to explain web components by first thinking about what problems do web components solve for developers. And when I think about building for the web in 2014, this is what I think about. I no longer think about just building for desktop or laptop, right? Now you've got to build for phones of every size, tablets, televisions, even wearable devices. We have watches now that can, run some bits and pieces of the internet. And so as developers, it means that, our users have an expectation on these devices of what our application should feel like, right? Someone on a mobile phone, they expect like a real app-like experience for the things that they're interacting with. But these are the tools that we have to work with to build those experiences. And oftentimes it can feel like our tools are kind of maybe basic or they just don't live up to that challenge, right? And it seems like to do even something very simple, like to build some tabs, in 2014, that should be very easy for us as developers, but in fact, it's still very, very hard. And I'll show you some examples of how we build tabs so you can kind of get what I mean. So if you use a library, maybe like Bootstrap or Foundation, and you want to build some tabs, it's probably going to look like this, right? And you don't have to read the code, but it's a lot of HTML, and then maybe you include some CSS, maybe you have some JavaScript to like make it all work, maybe some jQuery, right? That's one way. And there are libraries out there that mix HTML and JavaScript together. There are libraries which try and do this all in JavaScript, or as much in JavaScript as they can. And the problem here is that these libraries are all solving the same problem. They all give me the same thing, tabs, right? But they're all different. And so as web developers, it means that we are constantly learning new libraries and new frameworks. Every new project, every new team you go work on, you've got to learn some new way to build the same thing. It also means that, if you build tabs with this one framework, it's not necessarily going to work in this other one. So you're actually reinventing stuff over and over, which is a lot of waste. So this is where web components can come in and help us out. Now with web components, we can create our own custom HTML elements. We can create a paper tabs element, and this element has its own behavior, and it has its own look and feel. Most importantly, this element is built using the web platform. It's built using the DOM and the DOM APIs that are already in the browser. And so this means that I build this once, and then I can use it in any framework or any application that knows how to work with HTML and the DOM, which should be all of them. So how do we do this? Like, how do we get to this magical place where we can just build a component once and use it everywhere? Well, some engineers from the different browsers started looking at the problems that developers face all the time. And they were like, what are the developer needs? What are developers, using in every project, but that's not part of the web platform already? And so they came up with a few items. They realized developers need templating, they need scoping, they need encapsulation, they need resource management. And from identifying all of those needs, we got the 4 specifications which make up web components. So there is no one web component technology. It's actually 4 different technologies, which all fall under this component model umbrella. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually so you understand how they work. But the important thing that I want to point out here is that when I started looking into web components back in 2013, the browser support did not look this good. This is actually kind of promising, right? This looks like we're getting somewhere. And what's really exciting is, as of version 36 of Google Chrome, we are now shipping all of the web component standards. They are on by default. So if you're using Chrome Stable today, you get all of these specifications. Because Opera is a fork of Blink, they get all of the specifications as well. So that's 2 browsers that now ship all of web components. And as you can see, the folks at Mozilla and Firefox have been working on this as well. They've already shipped template, and they've got custom elements, shadow DOM, and HTML imports in Firefox nightly. Now, for the other browsers, we don't know, right? They don't always talk about what they're working on. And so this creates a problem. How do we get developers to use something before it's working in all browsers? Because as browser makers, we want you to use these things. We want you to use web components and to tell us the parts that are good, but more importantly, the parts that are bad, the parts that aren't working, right? The parts that make your job difficult. And we want to fix those before everything is finalized. And so to resolve this problem, we created a library at Google called Polymer. And Polymer is a library which enables the use of web components in all modern browsers. So that's Internet Explorer 10 and above, Safari 6 and above, mobile Safari, right? And it helps to think of Polymer as like 3 different layers or 3 different pieces. At the very bottom, we have these polyfills. So we have this thing called BrazilJS. And that adds support for web components to all the various modern browsers that are out there. But then we go a step further, and we load in Polymer.js. And Polymer.js, we call it, it's like sugar. It's basically a way to make you faster with web components. So it adds things like data binding, property observers, gesture support, and a really nice syntax for defining and registering your own elements. And lastly, we ship a set of components. So if you're not quite comfortable creating your own web component, but maybe you want to use some that other people have created, you can do that as well. And so with Polymer, it changes our support picture. Now, instead of this, it looks like this, right? And now that we have support for web components in all the modern browsers, we can actually explore what these 4 specifications give us. So we got templates, custom elements, shadow DOM, and HTML imports. And the first one I want to talk about is custom elements. And custom elements allow us to define new DOM and HTML elements. And the problem that it solves is this, right? This is a real application. This is Gmail. And if you open up the DevTools, this is what you're going to see. And if you are having trouble reading the code in the back there, I'll just tell it to you. It says div, 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 okay? Now, it's not that Gmail is a bad application. Gmail is awesome, right? Gmail is like an amazing application. But the problem is that HTML has not kept up with all of our needs, right? We need to build complex components, and all we really have is div. So we end up with div soup. Now, with custom elements, we can take all those crazy divs, and we can turn them into actual components. So this is a paper tabs component. You saw it earlier. And the thing here is that this is meaningful, right? I can read this. I can tell what this component does. There's a paper tabs element. There's 3 tabs inside of it. I know how I can add another tab to this thing, right? But also, we're leveraging the web platform here. So I've got a selected attribute up there. HTML tags have selected attributes, right? We know how to work with attributes on HTML elements. And if you look at this in JavaScript, we can use query selector to select this element. We can use add event listener to listen to the events that it fires. And so if we go down and we start interacting with this thing, you'll see that the selected property is changing as we click different tabs, and that activate event is firing, right? So if you already know how to work with HTML and the DOM, then you already know how to work with custom elements. And that's huge. You don't have to learn some whole framework to work with these things. Oh, one more thing. Custom elements also give us a common model to extend and inherit from other elements. And I'm going to talk about that in a few more slides, but I just wanted to point that out. So in these examples, at the top, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to make your own custom element using just vanilla JavaScript. Then I'll show you how to do it in Polymer, and then I'll show you how to actually use the tag that you've created. So just using vanilla JavaScript, we're going to call document register element. We pass in the tag name that we're trying to register, so paper tabs, trying to create a paper tabs HTML element. You pass in the prototype for your element, and this prototype needs to extend the HTML element prototype. But once you've done that, then you can add your own properties and methods to this new tag, which is really cool. So you can give it your own behavior. Now in Polymer, to make this a little bit easier, we actually created a custom element which allows you to create custom elements, which is a little weird, but it actually works really well. So you've got a Polymer element tag. You give it a name attribute for the tag that you're trying to register. And then any content that you place inside of there, that's just what's going to render on screen when the browser sees your new tag. And so to use this new element, we just drop a paper tabs element on our page, just like any other HTML tag. Or if you want to use it in JavaScript, you can say document create element, and you'll get an instance there. So simple, right? It's pretty easy. Now I mentioned that custom elements also allow you to extend other people's elements. And the syntax for that looks very similar. So we're going to call document register element. We'll pass in the tag name for the element that we're registering. So I'm registering a super button. When we pass in the prototype this time, we're going to extend a different element. We're going to extend HTML button element. So now I get all of the properties and methods associated with button. And lastly, I pass in the tag name that I'm extending. So I pass in the button tag. And now I've got a super button element. If I'm using Polymer, I use the Polymer element tag. I give it a tag name. And then I can just say, I extend this other tag. And Polymer is going to go ahead and set up the prototype chain for me, which is really nice. And so to use this new type extension element, we say button is super button. Or in JavaScript, we can say create element. We give it the original tag name and the extending tag. So that's custom elements. The next one I want to touch on is templates. And templates give us real templating in the browser for the first time. If you're working with libraries like Mustache or Handlebars, then you're probably already very familiar with how templating in the browser works. And so the browser makers saw that everybody's using templating libraries, and they said, hey, why don't we just add this to the browser, right? Like, everybody's doing it. Let's just make a tag for it. So in web components, you actually have a template element that you can use. And what's really cool is that the content that you place inside of that template is completely inert. It doesn't do anything. And so if you place an image tag inside of here, the request for that image is not going to fire. If you put JavaScript inside of here, it's not going to run. If you put audio or video inside of here, it's not going to play, right? Until you go and you actually grab it with JavaScript and stamp it onto the page. So using template is super simple. If you're just using vanilla JavaScript, use a template element, grab its content with JavaScript, stamp it out. That's it. If you're using Polymer, we said, hey, every element should have a template inside of it. So you say a Polymer element, put a template tag inside of there. That content is what's going to show up on screen when someone uses your tag. And we actually added a little bit more to the template tag. We added data binding and some other stuff to it. So if you want, you can take another template, you can nest it inside of your original template. You can bind it to a model. You can iterate over collections. You can do conditional templating, right? Stuff that you're used to with a lot of the template libraries that you use already. Okay, so we touched on custom elements, we touched on template. Last one is second to last one is Shadow DOM. And Shadow DOM's like, it's big, right? It's like way too big to cover in this talk. So I'm gonna try and give you like a really quick description of it. And the best way to think about Shadow DOM is imagine that you have some HTML, you have some CSS, and you create a little barrier around it, right? And by doing that, your component is guaranteed to render exactly as you intend it to. There will be no style conflicts from the parent document, right? The styles inside do not escape that barrier and affect anything. So you get CSS scoping, like real CSS scoping, for the first time ever in the browser. And what's interesting is that you've actually been working with Shadow DOM for like years, and you had no idea that you were doing it. So I'll show you an example. This is the video element, right? HTML5 video tag, you guys are familiar with it. So when I use one of these things, I give it a source, and then I can give it a controls attribute. And when I add that controls attribute, I'm gonna get all these buttons down here, right? I get a play button, scrubber, time code, volume slider. And you might be wondering, like, where do those come from? You might think that maybe the browser makers just like magically add those with C++ or something. But in fact, everything that you see there is Shadow DOM. And if you open up the dev tools in Chrome, you can actually go in and you can inspect those controls. There's a little switch that you can turn on called Show User Agent Shadow DOM. And you can explore inside the video element, and you'll see it's actually just divs and input tags that make up all those controls at the bottom there. So you've actually been working with Shadow DOM for a long time. Text area, input, right? All these elements that they have a little bit of a look and feel to them, those are all built using Shadow DOM. So to create your own Shadow DOM, super simple. You first select an element, and you call create shadow root on it. That'll give you a little shadow tree that you can add content to. So you can just throw in, some inner HTML if you want, or even better, take the contents from a template and place that into your Shadow DOM. Now, if you're using Polymer, we said, hey, every element's got to have a template tag inside of it. We'll take whatever you put into the template and throw that into the Shadow DOM for you. So you don't even have to write the JavaScript necessary to make that happen. We just do it for you. It also means that you can include external style sheets, which is really nice. Keeps your elements, all the styling in JavaScript separate if you want. And because Shadow DOM is such a massive topic, like we could do an entire conference exclusively on Shadow DOM. So what I'll suggest is that you go to HTML5 Rocks and you check out the 3-part series that we've written on Shadow DOM. We keep it up to date. It covers all the stuff I'm not talking about today, like styling Shadow DOM, pulling in external content into the Shadow DOM. Lots of good stuff there. The last thing I want to touch on are HTML imports. HTML imports just like fundamentally change the way that we load resources into the browser. So today, if you're using a library like Twitter Bootstrap, it probably looks like this, right? This is how you pull Bootstrap into your project. You got Bootstrap CSS, and the fonts, the JavaScript, the jQuery plugins, right? It's a lot of stuff. With HTML imports, we can turn this into just a single line. You say link rel equals import. You specify an HTML file that you actually want to load into your project. And that HTML file can contain all of the resources necessary to make Bootstrap work or any other library. And so this really changes the way that we work with third-party code. Instead of having to go to someone's GitHub page and read all the instructions and like figure out how to place all their stuff just the right way in your application, imports, you can just go to a site like customelements.io, can browse around until you find like an element that you would like to load into your application. You can use a tool like Bower or some other package manager to install it and actually pull that code down into your project. Then you just import it, right? So I'm just importing the definition for a couple elements here. I'm pulling in a core toolbar and core icon button. And after that, I just use them. There's no other elaborate thing that I need to do. I just import the definition for the stuff I want to use, and I work with it. Simple. So to recap really quickly, custom elements, you can create new HTML elements and extend existing ones. Templates give you native templating in the browser for the first time. Shadow DOM gives you scoped CSS, which is huge, and markup encapsulation. And with HTML imports, we can load in custom elements, we can load in additional resources and third-party libraries. So that's kind of the overview of web components. Now you guys understand those 4 different specifications that I was showing. When you combine them all together, you get some really powerful stuff, right? When you have all 4 of those things working at the same time for you, you can make some really cool stuff. And so what I want to do is I want to show off some of the things that developers have been producing now that web components have started to land in browsers. We can actually work with these things. And I want to start by talking about element sets, because really, you know, this kind of makes sense for web components, right? You're making these little individual elements. And if you remember earlier, I showed this slide to indicate, you know, how HTML today does not feel like it's really designed for applications. And I want you to imagine if we had the opportunity to completely reinvent HTML, starting today, starting in 2014. And maybe we could make it look more like this, right? And maybe we could take our sort of, you know, crazy div soup. What if we took that and instead made HTML elements that made sense for the mobile web and actually felt like the kinds of components that people who work in iOS or Android, what if our stuff felt like the kinds of components that they use? And just think about that. And so to try and like get to this point, on the Polymer team, we started a project called Core Elements. These are very sort of general utility custom elements, which you can use to scaffold your project. We got visual things like core toolbar, header panel, drawer panel, right? A lot of visual stuff there for kind of building the structure of your application. Then we also have non-visual things. We have things like core Ajax, core local storage. And it might seem weird to think about working with Ajax as like an HTML tag. But I promise you, when you do it, it's actually really amazing. It's a really effective way to work with external data. So I want to show you an example of some of these core elements. The first one I want to talk about is called core toolbar, which is just a really basic container that can hold controls like tabs or buttons or like a title, right? And I think it's a good place to start with web components because it's a very simple component. It doesn't really do a whole lot. And that way, you know, you can get up and running with it. Now, as I showed earlier, with any element, you first got to import the definition, and then you can just start working with the new tag. So I've imported my core toolbar, and I can just start working with that new element. I can give it I put a div inside of it and give it a header up there at the top. And because Shadow DOM gives me CSS scoping and encapsulation, I can throw additional elements into this toolbar. I can put a core icon button inside of there, and I get a little menu button. And I don't have to worry that the CSS from these two components is going to collide or do anything weird. Now, a really common pattern is to take a toolbar and put it inside of another element called a header panel. And core header panel is a very simple container. It has a header area up at the top, and then a content area down below. And its only job is to manage the scrolling behavior for our page. And so when it sees that there's a core toolbar inside of it, it knows that it should make that toolbar stick to the top of the document at all times. And so as the user is scrolling around, what you'll see here is My header stays sticky up there at the top, and all the content slides underneath it. Now, I want to point out, I'm not writing any CSS or JavaScript to make this happen, okay? Think about that. I'm just working with more powerful HTML elements. They're more app-like. And if I want to change the behavior of this header panel, I put an attribute on it, I tell it I want it to scroll, and now it's going to take my toolbar, it's going to take the content underneath and stick them together so that when the user is scrolling now, it actually slides off the page. So very quickly, I've changed just one attribute, and the behavior of my site is totally different. Now, another big aspect of building multi-device applications is responsive design. And so we created an element called core drawer panel, which is a responsive container. And it's got a sidebar on one side and a main content area on the other. And so if you have a child element that you put inside of there, you give it a drawer attribute, then any content that you put inside of that element is going to end up in the drawer. If you have a child with a main attribute, any content you place inside of there ends up in your main content area. Now, the cool thing is that on a phone, the drawer panel knows to take the sidebar and everything and move it out of the way, and only display that main content area. It has responsive design just built in. It already knows how to do this. And so when you combine all these things together, you combine header panel, toolbar, drawer panel, you put them all together, you can build these really cool, sophisticated app-like experiences just by bolting together HTML. Now, some of you may have seen at Google I/O, we talked about a new design system called Material Design. And this is really like Google's approach to building multi-device applications. And the implementation for material design on the web is through Polymer and through custom elements. And so we created a set of elements called paper elements to support material design. And paper elements are a little different from the core elements that I was showing. They're kind of more stylized, they have more animation, they do more with lighting and shadows. So an example of that is paper input. And paper input has a few really interesting attributes to it. The first is that it has this floating label attribute. So if I add that to a paper input, anytime the user is typing, it takes the label and it jumps it up above where they're typing, which is really useful on a small device like a phone or a tablet, where you still want the user to know what they're interacting with, but you don't always have a good place to put that label. And there's other attributes here too. We have validate attribute for doing validation on the fly. We have an error attribute for displaying an error message to the user if validation fails. But basically what you have is you have a new version of text input that makes sense in 2014, right? It feels like what people expect from applications. Another example, paper checkbox, right? Kind of a replacement for the input checkbox. And you'll notice that as the user is interacting with this, it has these like really cool animations to really show them like what they've just interacted with. When they tap on it, it has this sort of like explosive ink effect, which is good on a touch device, so the user sees that and they really get some good feedback, so they know what they're working with. And this kind of like explosive ink effect is so prominent in material design that we made it into its own element. So if you want just that kind of cool ink effect, you can drop a paper ripple tag into your application. You can put this inside of anything you want. I've just got it inside of like a div here with an image. And now anytime the user clicks on or taps on one of these squares, it's going to do this cool paper ripple effect. Another big part of material design is shadows, lighting and shadows. And we wanted to give developers the ability to create realistic shadows. So we created a paper shadow element. Any element that you put this inside of, you can give it a visual z-depth, just with an attribute. You can animate it. And so as the user is interacting with this card, we can make it sort of jump off of the page. So they're working with it, falls back down. It's a really simple way to add a bit more interactivity to your site or application. And again, I'm not writing a bunch of CSS or JavaScript to make any of this happen. I'm just working with more powerful HTML tags. Now, when you combine all of this together, you get an app like Topeka, which is something that the Polymer team created to really show off all of the different element sets. And everything that you're seeing here, all the animations that you're seeing, all the interactions that you're seeing, all built using web components, all built with custom elements from either the paper set or the core set. So you can build really powerful, sophisticated apps with this stuff. Now, if you want to check out the elements, we have a full catalog of all of them up on the Polymer website at polymerproject.org. There's a bunch to show, but I want to highlight some of the other work that's going on in the community. Because we're not alone. It's not just Google, it's not just Polymer that's building these things. A lot of you, maybe downstairs, have seen Firefox OS. The folks at Firefox have been working on their own set of web components called Brick. And Brick is awesome because it's very similar to the core elements. It's very similar to the element sets we're creating. But it was designed with a look and feel that's different. It's for Firefox OS. And so we still have custom elements. We have a Brick app bar. We have Brick deck for changing our content. We have Brick tab bar for flipping between states. But because web components are built on web standards, it means that we can mix and match them from different sets. So this application that I created, it's using Brick, but it's also using Polymer. So it's using the core icon buttons, which I didn't show earlier, but core icons, any icon that you see on the screen is actually a Polymer element. And although you can't see it right here, we've also got an Instagram element that was created by Adi Osmani, also using Polymer. So you combine all these things together, and you get this application that I created to let users sort of, tour around San Francisco and look at some photos from some different landmarks. But we're using Polymer and we're using Brick together in the same application, just to throw something together real quick. This was like a couple hours to put together. And it's not just browser makers that are building these things. There's a lot of developers in Brazil who are building web components and sharing them with the world. A lot of people ask us about Twitter Bootstrap. They're like, what about Bootstrap elements? That makes sense, right? Sure. Well, at the moment, you can't just take the Bootstrap style sheet and throw it into web components, though everyone tries. I've tried. Some of you might try. Some of you may have already tried. But there's developers who've actually been saying, okay, well, let's just take the parts of Bootstrap and let's make those into web components. So a developer named Mano Valtaro, I hope I said that right, created the Twitter Bootstrap grid custom element set, which just takes the grid from Twitter Bootstrap and turns that into custom elements that anyone can use in their site or application. Developers ask us all the time about routers, right? All the big frameworks have routers for changing what I'm seeing on screen when the URL changes. Well, a developer named Eric Ringsmith created an app router element, right? It handles hash changes, handles HTML5 push state. It actually goes out and it fetches more content for your site, depending on what the URL is. Adi Osmani created an element called Pager for doing pagination. I hate doing pagination, so thankfully Adi has solved this problem for me forever, which is really cool. And another developer named Ray Nicholas actually created an Ajax form element. It takes the form tag that we're all used to working with, and it just gives it superpowers, right? It prevents page refreshing. It allows you to send custom headers when you submit your form, gives you callbacks when validation fails, and it also lets you submit other people's custom elements. So if someone makes a custom text input or something like that, it'll let you submit those as well. And now that we have all of these components, we can build whole applications using this stuff, which is pretty exciting. So you check out the Polymer website, polymerproject.org. This is all built with custom elements and web components. ChromeStatus.com, another site just for keeping track of when things are landing in the different browsers. If you open up your DevTools and inspect this, you'll see it's all built with Polymer and web components. And we even created a tool which we call Designer, which we built it in web components, and it lets you build web components, it's a little weird, but it's actually pretty awesome because CSS and everything gives you really, really good scoping of your CSS and your DOM. you can actually just start dragging things onto the page and assembling an application in web components, and you don't have to worry that your styles are going to leak all over the place. So pretty cool, pretty fun project. Even GitHub is getting in on this. So you go to the GitHub website, you look at the, where it shows like what time your commit happened. It's like, I committed something 10 minutes ago. That little timestamp, it's actually a custom element. You can open it up and you can look at it in the dev tools. The thing that I'm most excited about, which actually is like not immediately apparent, like you don't realize this when you first start working with web components, but you can actually take your API and turn that into an element. And it's pretty powerful. So how many of you have worked with Google Maps before? All right, good, good. All of you, I hope. Now, if you want to add a map marker to Google Maps, how much code do you think it takes? I'll give you a hint. It takes that much code. It's a lot of code, okay? It's not trivial just to make a map show up and add a map marker to it using something like geolocation, okay? In the world of web components, this becomes a single tag. You can declare a Google map on your page. You don't have to worry about the styling. You don't have to worry about the JavaScript that loads in the Google Maps API, that talks to Google Maps, right? You just say, I want a Google map, and you get one, just as you expect. Now, under the hood, this element contains the Google Maps API, right? It lets us work with the Google Maps API, but it allows us to do it using HTML. So if I want to center this map on a latitude and longitude, I just give it a few attributes, right? If I want to zoom the map, it's an attribute. Simple. And if I want to add that map marker to my map, right? I want to add a map marker like that guy up there. I can just take a Google Map marker element and nest it inside of my map and give it a latitude and longitude. Oh. Now, at Google, we have over 250 APIs, which is a lot. And so what we've been doing is looking at all the different APIs and saying, hey, how many of these can we turn into web components? What about like Google Calendar or Google Sheets, or even better, Google Sign-In? Like, who likes doing OAuth? Nobody, right? Wouldn't it be cool if that was just a single tag that you could drop on your page? So if you go and you check out Google Web Components on github.io, we have a whole bunch of these things that we've been exploring, and there's going to be a whole lot more. So definitely check it out. Eric Beidelman has put together a video on YouTube which explains all this stuff. So if you want to go check that out as well. But again, it's not just Google, it's not just Polymer that's doing all this. The folks at Salesforce have actually started taking their API and turning that into components. And what's really cool is that they used the designer tool. They actually took our designer tool, because it's on GitHub, it's open source, and they extended it. And they added their own Salesforce components to it. So what you're seeing here is an application that's being built by members of the Salesforce mobile SDK team, these guys, Eugene Oxman and Akhilesh Gupta. And so all these components that you see are actually Salesforce elements that know how to connect to the Salesforce backend. They already know how to do authentication, work with the Salesforce API, do offline storage and sync, which is crazy. So developers who are using Polymer and Salesforce kind of get the best of both worlds, which is pretty cool. And what you're going to see here in a second is Akhilesh is actually going to open up the code inspector in the designer. He's going to grab all that code, and he's going to drop it into Cordova and actually run it on the iOS simulator and the Android simulator, which is pretty dope. All right, so how do you guys get in on this? Well, the first thing you got to do is you got to keep learning. Web components are big. It's a lot of new stuff, right? I only covered a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of it. So if you go to webcomponents.org, which was put together by many members of the Brazil developer community, there's talks, videos, presentations, slides. This is the place to go to get kind of like a total explanation of web components. Also, more importantly, Zeno, who's running around here, has stickers for webcomponents.org. So if you want stickers, you can find Zeno, or you can come talk to me later on. If you go to polymerproject.org, you can learn all about Polymer. There's tons of stuff there, getting started guide, tutorial, all the element sets. And once you start learning, you got to build. You got to get your hands dirty. So if you're into Yeoman generators, the webcomponents.org guys have put together a Yo element generator. This will actually help you create your very first web component. On the Polymer team, we created a Yo Polymer generator. So if you want to build like a big Polymer application, if you want to include like Sass and page speed insights, auto prefixer, got all that inside of there. We're also adding browser testing using Sauce Labs and Mocha, which is pretty cool. Also, I maintain this, so if it's broken, you can just like yell at me. Now, if you're not so into Yeoman, we've got a seed element project that you can work with. You can just go to GitHub and download the seed element. And Adi Osmani has very kindly put together a video which will walk you through it and explain how to use it and how to create your very first element and how to share it with the world. And that leads to the last point, which might be the most important point, is you got to share. If you're building stuff, you got to put it out there for other people to see and to learn from. So customelements.io, another amazing site built by developers from Brazil. You can go here, you can browse all the custom elements that have been created very easily. You can preview them, play around with them. And if you want to share your own element on customelements.io, you just add one line to your Bower JSON file, you add a web components keyword, and then when you register your element, it'll show up there. Lastly, and most importantly, you got to keep exploring, okay? This is a completely new world, right? Web components are different from everything that has come before. We are learning all of the best practices as we go. It's kind of a really fun, exciting time because we're making stuff, we're experimenting, we're figuring things out. And it's up to all of you to grow this community, okay? Already so many developers from Brazil have been contributing to it, growing it, expanding it, and we want to keep that happening. So explore, share, encourage one another, and together we can all revolutionize the mobile web. So thank you all so much for having me out today. Follow me on Twitter.